Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Azim Lila from CIBC, Digital Analytics and Integration, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. We have an excellent panel for you today to talk about accessibility for the underbanked. Not only is our panel experts in their field, they're joining us from around the world. As you'll first and shortly hear, we have Dr. Dorothe Singer from the World Bank joining us from Washington, D.C. We have Dr. Adamson joining us here from Australia. It's mighty early there for him, but welcome. Dr. Ravi Malhotra is joining us from Ottawa as a full professor. And I also would like to welcome Professor Vanisha from Toronto from Osgoode Law School. What I want to first say is welcome to everybody joining us from across Canada, coast to coast, and to our global audience. Accessibility for the underbanked is a multifaceted topic. As thought leaders and practitioners in the field, today's panelists will consider both the opportunities and challenges we confront to making universal banking a possibility. Our panelists bring together expertise in law, economics, technology, and banking. We have a great audience as well, representing bank regulators, digital banking leaders, fintechs, innovators, and many change agents who are keen on making banking more accessible for all. Who are the excluded? What barriers exist? What can be done to remove these barriers? How big is this cohort? And what role can law and technology play to find real solutions? As Dr. Singer from the World Bank will highlight, this is a huge population. 1.7 billion people are without a bank account, based on the last Findex report. In Canada, Acorn Canada estimates that 3% of the population, or close to 1 million, are unbanked, and close to 15% are underbanked in Canada. Now, let me formally introduce our panel members and highlight a little bit of the research before opening it up. As I've mentioned, Dr. Singer joins us from the World Bank from Washington, D.C., and she's the co-author of the Findex report on financial inclusion and other leading policy papers on the role of regulation in financial inclusion. Dr. Adamson joins us from Australia, as I've mentioned, and he represents, as a global expert, IEEE, the Standards Association on Digital Inclusion, Identity, Trust, and Agency. Greg is also a former banker and a leading thinker on ethics and AI. Professor Vanisha Sukdeo is joining us here from Toronto and is with Osgoode Law School. Her expertise is around corporate social responsibility, extra-legal affairs, and regulatory mechanisms. And finally, Dr. Ravi Malhotra is a full professor from the University of Ottawa, and his extensive research is on disability rights and human rights law. So I'd like to welcome everyone here today. I'd like to now ask each panel member to share their thoughts on a few questions. So I'll ask the first question to Dorothe, and then we will proceed with seeking input from everyone else on this panel. So question one is, who are the excluded when we talk about the unbanked and underbanked? And what are the barriers that exclude them from modern banking services?
Thank you, Azim, and I'm very pleased to be here today and share some of our insights from the Global Findex database. As Azim mentioned, according to our database, there's 1.7 billion unbanked adults around the world, and I want to give you a little background about how we know this, how we collect the data, and then talk a little bit about what we know about the excluded and what they tell us ourselves about why they're not using formal financial services. So we know how many people are unbanked around the world because in 2011, the World Bank launched the Global Findex database, the world's most comprehensive database on how adults around the world save, borrow, make payments, and manage financial risks. It's a database that's compiled based on over 150,000 interviews collected in over 140 countries every 3 years. was first launched in 2011, and since then we've collected a second round in 2014, a third round in 2017, and we're currently in the field collecting data, the latest round. We were supposed to collect data actually that was supposed to be published this year, but unfortunately COVID kind of intervened. So the numbers I'm sharing with you today are from 2017, and we hope that we've seen an increase in financial inclusion when we release our new numbers next spring. So 1.7 billion unbanked. That means that there's a huge population out there that's unbanked. At the same time, it means that globally we see that 69% of adults around the world do have an account, either at a financial institution or through a mobile money service provider. And that's actually been great progress. Since we've collected the data first in 2011, that's been an increase from 51% in 2011. So who are the unbanked and where are they? Well, as you can imagine, financial inclusion varies quite a bit around the world. As you might expect, adults in high-income countries such as Canada is on their financial inclusion in terms of measured being having an account, again, be that through a financial institution or through a mobile money account. Even though in high-income countries, it's basically financial institution accounts. Financial inclusion is basically universal, but it's not so in developing countries. And there, when we look at that, we see a large variation across countries there as well. So India and China, for example, 80% of adults had an account in 2017, which is, a large number. But given their sheer size in terms of population, they're also two of the countries with the most unbanked adults in terms of number of adults in the world. And indeed, half of the unbanked adults live in just 7 countries around the world. Again, we do our numbers population-based. So what do we know about the unbanked? Well, we know that the unbanked are predominantly women. They're disproportionately adults living in poorer households within economies. We also know that they're more likely to be out of the labor force, less educated, also younger adults, actually. In terms of reasons why people are unbanked, again, we did ask those people themselves what they see as barriers to their own use of formal financial services. And there we give people a range of options, and on average, people report 2 reasons for not having an account. By far, the most common reason for not having an account is not having enough money. 2/3 of adults report that as a reason. But other cited reasons include cost, financial services being too expensive, basically, distance, trust in financial institutions, a family member already having an account, and lack of documentations. As I'm sure everyone in the audience is well aware, financial institutions have to comply with know your customer requirements, and not everyone has the necessary documentations to do so. Maybe let me stop here. As a quick overview of what we know globally about who the unbanked are and why they say they don't use financial services.
No, thank you for highlighting some of the data points you've been collecting over the last several years, Dorothe, around who the underbanked are, and and obviously this is a global global topic, and maybe from a Canadian perspective, I can share some data, but I'd love to maybe ask Ravi for his perspective on who he thinks the excluded and underbanked are in Canada, and what some of those barriers are that from a person with disabilities perspective or other perspective, what Ravi thinks the underbanked and unbanked are.
Well, thank you for having me this afternoon, Azim. So I'm going to be speaking about people with disabilities as one segment that experiences issues related to banking and being underbanked and unbanked. I work overwhelmingly throughout my academic career on disability rights. I've had disability since birth, and I work with organizations, certainly in the past, like the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, which is the national cross-disability organization that lobbies for people with a wide range of disabilities. Of course, I'm here speaking solely for myself this afternoon. But for those of you that are not familiar, while in fact, I do think the Canadian banking sector has done more than some others in Canada, and in the Accessible Canada hearings for the Accessible Canada legislation, I was very pleased in preparing this talk to learn that the Canadian Bankers Association had made submissions to Parliament in favor of the now enacted, as of 2019, Accessible Canada legislation. Nonetheless, people with disabilities have remained marginalized, notwithstanding the inclusion of people with disabilities in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Unlike a lot of other groups, a lot of people in many sectors, I think including banking, have the jargon, shall we say, or the discourse of EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion. But I would submit that disability is something that still makes people uncomfortable. People with disabilities are often the group left out when it comes to equity, when it comes to EDI. And so some basic statistics are that unlike most other equity diversity groups, most people with disabilities in Canada, and this applies mutatis to other countries, are not even in the labor market. Only 59% are employed compared to 80% without disabilities. And some statisticians would put that figure even lower, depending on how you could define disability. So, there's methodological issues that are complicated. So it's estimated that increases in output and productivity associated with a higher level of labor force participation of people with disabilities could raise Canada's gross domestic product by about 3.2%. There you go. That's your business case for including people with disabilities, both as customers and as workers. You've got to look at all aspects of this, because right now it's not just labor market participation, it's also that every metric, people with disabilities or disabled people are much more likely to be living in poverty. Benefits to business, you have a client base that's expanded. You get businesses that are diverse. Recently, the Wall Street Journal featured a profile of restaurateurs, both of whom are wheelchair users. And what did they do? They used their lived experience to design a restaurant that was accessible, that would exceed the standards of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which frankly was enacted in 1990 by the first Bush administration. The Accessible Canada Act is coming into play 30 years later. And certainly later on, I could elaborate a little bit. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but the fact of the matter is, if you distinguish accessibility legislation from human rights legislation, accessibility legislation being more specific, giving you guidelines on what to do, Canada is quite far behind. When you have entrepreneurs like the example I gave you for this restaurant in, I think it's Spanish Harlem, they're going to attract customers that have disabilities. Why? Because they've exceeded the standards in disability legislation. And so removing these barriers that prevent people with disabilities from purchasing goods and services, which I would submit to you does include financial services, will result in a virtuous circle. You want to get away from vicious circles and create virtuous circles. You have customers that have accessibility, they're going to contribute with bank loans, other services. They're going to create an economy that has benefits for people with disabilities. And that's why legislation like the Accessible Canada Act are so important. If you're not familiar, it came into force in July 2019. And because of COVID-19, I think that it has not received a lot of attention it came about at a time that was complicated. But once COVID-19 dissipates, I think that a lot of people will pay much more attention to it. And in fact, the government of Canada released proposed regulations in February of this year. I think it's received virtually no media attention, and that's because policymakers are grappling with the pandemic. I'm well aware that my colleagues here today are in a federally regulated sphere, but I think it's important to know that, so without getting you into a utterly boring digression of Canadian constitutional law, there are venues that are provincially regulated. So trust companies, I believe, and this is arcane, but there are contexts where it may be your colleagues in adjacent industries. And frankly, that's most things that are provincially regulated. Banking is a bit of an anomaly. So if you're dealing with other segments of the economy, and of course you are, that's what you do on a daily basis, it's important to be aware that some provinces, and hopefully more, have legislation analogous to the Accessible Canada Act. And the oldest, thanks to a man, David Lepofsky, that's worked across the political spectrum with all political parties to build the AODA Alliance. And that refers to the Ontario legislation that was the first in Canada, modeled in some respects on the Americans with Disabilities Act, but really is a made in Ontario project. It's now been replicated in a number of other provinces, not as many as I would like, but British Columbia has legislation at this moment that is going to be enacted in law by the current government, and it does already exist in Nova Scotia and Manitoba. The details vary, but the idea here is that you've got timelines that set out standards for the different areas. So in the federal sphere, banking, telecommunications, transportation, and the federal government itself, these are set out. But and perhaps in a future moment, I will tell you more. But I think I'm coming to the end, and I'll turn it back to our moderator.
Well, thank you, Ravi, for highlighting this very important cohort and also the business case as you framed it around the untapped opportunity they present from a payments or from an industry perspective. I think that's a very, very good point. I'll ask Vanisha for her thoughts on who the excluded are when we talk about the unbanked or underbanked and some of the barriers that you can highlight from your expertise.
Thank you. I was interested in hearing what Ravi was going to say about constitutional law. I perked up. So I'm going to focus on the duty to accommodate. So when we talk about human rights and when we talk about this need for integration and full participation, how are people with disabilities included versus excluded? And this notion of dignity, right? So are we meeting people with disabilities where they are? Or are we expecting them to kind of integrate into mainstream, and I use that in quotes, society, right? Are we bending to them, or do we expect them to bend to us as, mainstream society? And so, as I said, I look to the duty to accommodate. Often my research takes me to labor and employment law, but we can think about this as a bigger obligation, right? In the context of if you are a disabled worker, how would your workplace accommodate you? But as well, there are obligations on banks as an institution that provides services to the public, to make sure that there is this corresponding obligation that persons with disabilities have access. And so when I'm asked about barriers, I view that both in a physical manner as well as beyond just physicality. And so when we think about ensuring that all have access to the services in an equal manner, right? This is important to think about an equal manner or somewhat equal, right? We can't expect it to be, perfect equality, but to try to make sure that we're meeting people where they are. And so the banking industry has obligations to its customers to ensure that it is accessible. We can think about kind of more straightforward examples, like someone who's using a wheelchair. Does the bank have a physical ramp, right? So that person can now gain access physically to the banking structure. And we can think about people who have disabilities, who are blind or deaf, and are they able to use the bank as well? And so when we think about this notion that there is this duty to accommodate, there's also a limit, which is termed in law undue hardship. So the example I often use in my teaching is where a school is now required to put in a ramp because there is a wheelchair user, and the institution might say, well, that's too expensive. And so often cost is used as an undue hardship. But does it matter when we think about the context? Is this about one wheelchair user versus 50 wheelchair users? Where do we draw the line to say that undue hardship and cost associated with making sure that physical spaces are accessible? When do we kind of accept that argument? And when do we say that is not a valid argument? And so how far must the duty to accommodate actually be? And when we talk about that duty, it is both ways. The person who is asking for accommodation has to be willing to accept reasonable accommodation, not just saying that they are the one seeking accommodation and everything has to satisfy their needs. They have to be able to or be willing to compromise. And so it does flow both ways. And I think something that is becoming more of is becoming a bigger topic when we think about disability and what that means in the human rights context is not just physical disabilities like the ones the examples I gave about a wheelchair user or someone who we can see is, if you can tell that someone is blind or deaf, and now moving to mental health concerns, right? And the one area I thought of, when you think about mental health accommodation, again, I'm most familiar with the academic setting and making sure students gain more, time and things to write their exams. But when it comes to mental health, I'm trying to think of how might this be relevant to the banking industry. And I thought about movie theaters offering specific show times for people who are autistic, that they have, if you have issues with sensory overload and that it's quieter and I think the lighting is different, I'm not too certain. And I was thinking maybe that would be something the banks might have to consider in the future as well. How are you accommodating someone who has issues about sensory overload or needs different lighting requirements, or needs a quieter atmosphere if they're coming physically to the bank or whatever other space. Again, in particular, maybe at the university, if there's going to be need in the future to accommodate that person, that individual who has autism. And will there maybe be a designated space for these people, for persons with certain disabilities, if we have to think about these different considerations? How are we going to accommodate that? And another example I thought of was service animals, right? That if someone is blind and they use a guide dog, again, there's access to a physical bank. How is there accommodation for service animals? And not just, again, the instant example, a quick one we think of is someone who is legally blind and they have a guide dog and they use that. So there might be accommodation already at the banks for that they're allowed to bring in their guide dog. But how do we distinguish between a service animal like a guide dog and an emotional support animal? And so that is also becoming a bigger topic for discussion, right? Mental health and thinking about someone who has anxiety perhaps and uses an emotional support animal. How are they accommodated in the physical space of a bank? And I actually have a specific memo in my legal research and writing class. I ask students to write about this, emotional support animals, because it is an area of law that is not settled law, as we would say. It's still ongoing, and you've probably seen these, people bringing emotional support peacocks onto planes and mini horses. Where do we draw the line, right? And I think the law is still deciding that. So if we accept dogs as emotional support animals and they might be accommodated in a banking institution in that physical space, do we then draw the line at other larger animals, right? That how far do we have to meet someone's needs if they are a person with a disability? How far does that actually stretch? And I also thought about many years ago, I took an American Sign Language class, so for persons who are deaf, and to think about how they've already been accommodated in different ways, and I'll speak more to that later. but just that what we view as almost impossible and what we accept as mainstream and normal is constantly changing, right? And so what was deemed normal in the past, we think, well, that was not accommodation in what we understand it or in the way we understand it today. Hopefully that will be a constant in the future, that there is further progress in a way that we don't even notice these things anymore. They're just so accepted as part of our society. Like when curbs were cut for wheelchairs and things like that, it was almost different at the time, but now it's just everywhere, and crosswalks and, you know, things like that, that the advances that we think are about accommodating disabled persons, that they, at the time, they're somewhat, they take adjustment, but then we just accept them, and they become so normalized and so commonplace. So that's everything I want to say on that. So back to Azim.
Yeah, thank you, Vanisha. I really like the example you talked about, how the person with, you gave the analogy of bending, right? The idea of which way should the bending happen? Like, does society bend to the individual, or does or is it the other way around? And I think, you know, that draws on the medical model and the social model of disability, which we can talk about later. But I wanted to ask Greg now for your expertise and perspective, especially, you know, like you talked about ramps, Vanisha, but maybe we also need to think about digital ramps, because, you know, that's another layer of conversation beyond physicality. But I'll pass it over to Greg to share his thoughts, please.
Thanks, Azim. So this is there's a lot that I can't add because so much of it has already been covered, but I wanted to pick out three particular areas. The first in relation to the banking services themselves, and Dorothe made a reference to this. People need to be able to save. They need to be able to get loans according to their capacity to pay. They need to be able to insure the things that they value. And this is the heart of it. It's not about the technology. It's about being able to access these services in a way that is meaningful for them. Ravi talked about the opportunity in relation to people with disabilities. As an ex-banker myself, I tend not to focus on the opportunity, because that makes me as a banker look self-serving. I tend to focus on our social license to operate. That is, banks are given an enormous amount of leeway within society. When everything goes wrong, trillions of dollars are found to recapitalize this. And so we owe a service to society. We need that social license to operate. And if we decide to refuse to service some customers, then we can't claim that we're providing that service. And this also comes brings up the idea of obligations that Vanisha was talking about. So we have those banking services. Separately, we have, and I'll speak about this in another question, the technology. What is the technology there? But the third area is one of trust. Do people trust our the services that are provided to them? Because if they don't trust them, they're not going to use them, or at least they're going to use them in an extremely limited manner. So those three things, those three aspects, really say that there can't be a magic bullet. There's not a magic bullet. We have to think about how each of those pieces intersect. And how, when we're doing regardless of what our day job is, in my case, it was a risk manager, in other people are working at the front line, or doing the planning, figuring out doing the calculations, all that sort of stuff. All these pieces come together to make up a financial service, and all of these need to consider that question of inclusion and how we make sure that we include everybody. I don't want to. Because others have covered so much, I'll stop there, but I'll pick up some of these points in a moment.
Thank you, Greg. We do have a few questions from the audience, which I will acknowledge, from Rebecca and Adam. We'll open up the questions to the panelists a little bit later, in about 15 minutes or so. But please do keep sharing your questions. I am receiving them. But I wanted to ask Greg for the second question. Since you chair and are with IEEE, what role do you see technology playing, including any technology approaches? I know you mentioned you don't want to focus too much on the technology, but it's, at the heart of it's the savings, etc. But maybe you could talk about the role of standards or the role of technology to or approaches to see the gap close.
Yeah. Thanks, Azim. So the group that we have, which looks at digital inclusion, identity, trust, and agency, takes up those barrier questions that people don't necessarily think about, or they find them too hard to deal with. So it's not just, is there a physical communication connection to my village? So we have a work that we're doing with IIT Bombay, where we look at not just can we get the communication link to the village, but what happens when people try to use high-speed internet connections, and that's what we're looking at there, high-speed connectivity in remote communities. And one of the questions that came up, the first training question that was asked by many of the women who were using these services were, how do I hide my search history? That was the first question. How do I hide my search history so my husband can't see what I've been looking at? And that's very revealing. People want to trust the technology. They don't want the technology to give them away, to turn them in, to disclose their own secrets as they're learning, or their own secrets as they're trying to achieve savings for the family and the benefit, and for example, to provide education to children. So that was a very insightful thing. It wasn't just, do I have an internet connection? It was, how do I use this thing in a way that doesn't hurt me or doesn't hurt my family? Another question which is very important is that we cannot equate a digital account with banking inclusion. The two just don't go together. And if we look at the numbers, we look at the number of accounts which aren't used. So it's all very well to look at the number of accounts that people have, but you look at the number of accounts that have where no transactions occur, and we see a slightly different message. We see someone was encouraged and perhaps rewarded to establish an account, but then they didn't use it. In terms of the digital ramps, other questions, people will be familiar with the problem of one form of digital exclusion, which is financial abuse. We also see this in the area of technology abuse. The use of say IoT devices to remotely deny a family air conditioning because the breadwinner feels the family doesn't need to have a cold house or a warm house, doesn't need to be using that electricity. So that's something that's an area where that we have to consider. And if we take a broader picture, we can think of all of this online access as accessing cyberspace. We can think of it as the ability of people to connect with all the connected community. And in order to achieve that access, in order to be able to join with the rest of the community, the rest of the global community, to participate in this domain of human endeavor, we have to look at those barriers, consider those barriers, and eliminate those barriers. We can do that through standards. We can do it through understanding. We can do it through multidisciplinary engagement when we're building out those services for the currently excluded or the currently underbanked. But to get back to my point, particularly for people in the fintech community who are participating in this conference, never assume that you, as a fintech developer, have a clear understanding of your potential community. Always go out, reach out to that community, speak to the community as broadly as possible in order to make sure that your product, which is going to be fantastic, which is absolutely fantastic, is actually usable and helpful, and people want to adopt it, not just something that you and your friends felt was the way that people should do things.
Thank you, Greg. I'll ask Dorothe to share her thoughts on what she thinks the role of technology is playing, and any approaches that seem to be gaining traction from these surveys that she spoke about earlier.
Thanks, Azim. And yeah, I just want to actually pick up on Greg's last point that in order for people to use those services, those financial services that are offered, right, they need to be something that people actually want to use, right? They need to meet a certain need. They need to be easy to use, convenient to use, and also at a cost that makes sense, right? They're not going to use something that's more expensive or less convenient than cash to use. So that's something that often gets forgotten. And I think when we think about the role of technology in that, you know, M-Pesa, the mobile money service that kind of first made it big in Kenya, that I'm sure everyone is familiar here, is a great example there, right? They found out that, you know, messaging around sending money home, a domestic remittance payments in a very convenient way, sending it through a mobile phone instead of having to get on a bus, you know, going back to your village to share money with your family, was a more easy and cheaper way and more convenient way to send money, right? And so when we think about technology, you know, that's one of the ways that technology is so very important when we think about increasing financial inclusion, not just in terms of bringing people who have been outside the formal financial service, but also increasing the use of financial services among those who already have an account, right? I mean, that's another point Greg mentioned. It's not just about giving people an account, right? What we want is for them to use it, because that only when they use it will they reap the benefits of having an account. So, you know, when I think about technology and what it can enable in terms of financial inclusion, it's one on bringing down the cost of providing financial services for financial institutions, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, about a quarter of adults who don't have a financial institution account tell us that's a barrier to financial inclusion. And I mean, the unbanked adults today, I mean, when we're talking about them, those are people who typically have, you know, make very small transactions, have small savings. And in order for banks or other financial institutions to serve them, they also need to have a business case, right? If it's cheaper to serve those customers, they're more likely to do that and in a financially sustainable way. Technology can also help in terms of bringing financial services closer to people, right? I mean, you know, before, you know, everyone had a mobile phone in their pocket or their hand, right? I mean, people went to a bank branch to do to take care of their banking needs. And the reality is that, especially in developing countries, not everyone lives close to a bank branch, right? So a quarter of adults, of unbanked adults, tell us that distance is a barrier to their use of formal financial services. But technology, again, in the role of mobile phones or broadband connectivity, can provide an important on-ramp to financial services. As we see in our database, 2/3 of unbanked adults today already have a mobile phone. So that's potentially a way to reach them with formal financial services. Right? You know, obviously there's more to financial inclusion than just someone having a phone and providing services. There's a lot of, you know, other things that need to happen kind of in the background. And again, I'm also kind of jumping on what Greg mentioned earlier. You know, this starts with having very basic infrastructure and not even just broadband connectivity or mobile connectivity, but is there reliable access to electricity, right, to power those networks? Then there's, of course, also the financial infrastructure, be that from payment systems, regulations. I mean, this will speak more to the audience here, I guess. But also, you know, consumer protection safeguards and standards. I mean, many people who come into the financial system for the first time may not be as familiar with that. So consumer protection is important. And then, yeah, maybe another point to note on technology, and I think this is something that came up in the chat as well, is that when we talk about technology, of course, we're potentially also introducing barriers to financial access, right? And if we think about, in some countries, there's a great gender gap, not just in access to financial services, but sometimes even a greater gap in terms of access to technology, right? Who has access to the mobile phone that a family has? Maybe there's only one, maybe the woman doesn't have access. So I think, in our database, we see a lot of variation around the world around that. We also see that technology can close the barrier. For example, when we look at, looking at some African countries where mobile money has really taken off, we see that whereas we see a gender gap, so men are more likely than women to have financial services, we see a gap in the use of accounts at the financial institutions, but we don't see a gender gap in the use of mobile money services. So again, some suggestive evidence that technology can also play a role in closing the gap. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Those are some very good examples to build on Greg's initial thoughts, but also to add, like you said, 2/3 of that population have mobile phones, so maybe there's an opportunity there as well. I'll ask Vanisha. You mentioned maybe I'll ask Vanisha, like, what role do you see technology playing, especially maybe within a more Canadian context here, because a lot of your students and work you do is at the university level, so you may have you may have a perspective that may be a little bit different from a Canadian context.
So I was going to talk about technology as a way of kind of leveling the playing field, but in a way also of almost masking disability. As I said, I took a sign language class years ago, and my instructor, I remember her saying that with the increase in technology or these advancements, that when she uses her phone to text someone, they don't know that she's deaf, right? That you can't tell that by a text message. But then are we asking persons with disabilities to mask those disabilities, or are we willing to have those disabilities unmasked? But again, in context or in comparison with this leveling of the playing field, or how people enjoy life and your lived experience, do you expect that to be different or the same or somewhat similar to people who do not have a disability? And so I was thinking just about these advancements like telephone banking and online banking, and how those advances in technology have eliminated the need to be physically present at a bank, right? You don't actually have to go to the branch. And we see this now more during a pandemic, that this is beneficial to everyone, not just those who have physical limitations. And even in my world of Zoom teaching and online learning, we think about these requests that persons with disabilities had made prior to the pandemic for years, asking for these precise accommodations because of their disabilities that are now available to everyone, right? They were told in the past that sometimes these accommodations were too difficult. But when all of a sudden the world stopped because of COVID-19, we see that these things could have been accomplished all along. And only when there is an emergency for everyone do we see this action being made and action and steps being taken, and even somewhat drastic actions being taken. So we see the creation of something that I think is akin to Zoom banking, right? That you see these commercials on TV where a banker will chat with you online on video to give you advice, so you don't have to actually physically be at the bank. And to me, that is very much like how I teach on Zoom, that you're able to interact, or what we're doing now. You see the person, you can hear the person, you have some interaction that's almost like being there in person. And so when we think about those platforms, can we expand that to banking? Well, it seems like that has been done to a certain extent. And we see that technology is making the home more of a center, right? That more so our lives during the pandemic, where we're stuck at home and having to think about all the things we need to do that often would require us leaving our house. And these new creations may stay in place for everyone, right? That we think about people who are working from home and enjoying that process, or wanting to remain working from home rather than returning to the office. So maybe the same will be it will be the same for this kind of Zoom banking or whatever the actual terminology is, that people won't want to physically go to a bank to speak to a staff member at the bank. They would rather just stay in their home and kind of connect online in that way. And we can also think about those video services that we can include closed captioning for the deaf or hard of hearing, while if you think about in person, you're not able to really communicate in that way if you are a deaf person, unless there is a sign language interpreter or something like that available. But these advancements in technology creating more ability or greater ability for those who are deaf or hard of hearing and those who are blind to be able to use that same technology in a different manner than someone who does not have a disability, but still be able to make use of that technology. I think that many of those tools that are being used in my online teaching and everyone else who's teaching online, those are quite transferable to online banking, and especially when we look at the video functionality, right? And as I said, all these kind of built-in systems that allow for closed captioning and other tools like that those could very easily stay in place. So that was it. Thank you.
Nope. I love that idea, of the Zoom banking. I think that's a really good idea where you don't have to go to the bank per se, but it comes to you, right? And your home is more at the center. Ravi, do you want to share some thoughts? And I want to then bring in some questions from the audience. So Ravi, do you have any thoughts on how technology is also leveling the playing field, or the role of technology? And then there's some questions on technology from the audience, which I'll read out in a moment.
Okay, so I think the takeaway point for me is the slogan of many of us in the disability movement that identify proudly and confidently as people with disabilities, which is nothing about us without us. You actually are seeing other social movements starting to use this phrase. I'm not going to get into a discussion of who had it first, but it's often attributed to the disability community, the idea that you do this. And so I will say in my few minutes, very few minutes that I have about some specifics, but I think the biggest takeaway is that if you don't have an accessibility universal design lens built in, including consultations with people with disabilities or disabled people at the design phase, then it's quite likely that your outcome, whether you're talking about an ATM or ABM, or you're talking about something fancier like blockchain, which frankly I don't even understand, to give you the analysis, none of that is actually going to work unless you have people with disabilities involved in the process. So what are takeaways so that people can go back to your offices and directly apply it? Well, it depends. I mean, the CCD, as I've referred to, does work across disabilities in many areas. But while I don't directly work on a lot of these things, I'm not blind. Many of the issues, just as an illustration, are faced by people that are blind or have visual impairments. And you want a takeaway point, sit down, take 15 minutes out of your day at the Alliance for Equality of Blind Canadians website. And you can go, I think the URL is simply blindcanadians.ca, but you can Google and get the exact site, and you'll see a variety of recommendations, including using ABMs that come with audio software. And there was a man who's very well known in the blind community named Stark, recently passed away, but he had done human rights litigation successfully to get banks to modify and build ABMs, ATMs that are accessible for people that have impairments like blindness. But as technology changes, you're going to have more and more issues. So a colleague of mine that's blind was saying, well, what about e-transfers? And again, I can't speak to you in a technical way, but I think as bankers, banking industry, bank tellers, banking community goes into more and more areas, embraces technology, you're going to have an accessibility lens. And that brings me I think I've got a few minutes before I turn it back to Azim, things like the regulations under the Accessible Canada Act. And it's important in the banking community to recognize that in February 2021, those regulations were issued, and I expect they will be adopted. The Canadian Bankers Association has been supportive, and they set out specific timelines for private sector entities with 100 or more employees to publish initial accessibility plans by June 1st, 2023. Now that may change, but that is in the proposed regulation. And I'd submit to you that probably if you're working in banking, a whole lot of you in the audience have private sector entities with 100 or more employees. You're going to have a responsibility under an accessibility plan. So it's time to get a handle on your technology, consult with people with disabilities who are your employees. If you don't have employees that have disabilities, well, then you've got a different problem. But I'm assuming you do, and so you start out, do your outreach, and build that into your accessibility features, because you're going to have to report back. You're going to be expected under the proposed regulations to have accessibility plans, and my understanding is you're going to be required to show how in these accessibility plans you've consulted with stakeholders who have disabilities in your consultation. So that means you've got to make sure it's accessible and that you've consulted. Your output will be much better if you're inclusive for people with disabilities right from the beginning. The social model of disability is all about eliminating structural barriers. This isn't a sociology class, but what I can tell you is nothing about us without us. Put people with disabilities at the center of what you do. Pay attention to your responsibilities under the Accessible Canada Act, because those regs are coming, and it's up to you to watch out for it. So I'll turn it back to Azim.
Yeah, thank you. One of the questions that came from Adam is, without addressing the digital divide, literacy gap, and universal digital ID, we risk permanently financially excluding certain groups. And he's asking, how do we close those gaps before they are structural barriers? So I know, Greg, do you want to just talk about universal digital IDs and maybe just touch on that, and then I'll bring up Rebecca's question next.
Yeah, just very quickly, we have to be careful to make sure that digital IDs achieve the goals we're trying to achieve. For example, we just can't put a name on everybody in the world and use that as the identifier. That will cause problems. So that there's a lot of work being done in this field. We're doing work on gender equity and social inclusion with the Asian Development Bank and the University of Melbourne. This is not a simple question, but it's a question which we must work on.
Okay, and I'll ask Dorothe to maybe respond to Rebecca's question. What options would you recommend for facilitating payments to people that do not have a bank account? Are there any innovative solutions outside of checks? I'm not sure, Dorothe, if you want to talk about how do you facilitate payments without a bank account? Do you have any case studies or thoughts on what you've encountered?
Thank you. Well, I mean, that's a question that just illustrates how important it is to have an account now. I think something that many of us take for granted. But I mean, I will say that, especially in the context of the pandemic and many governments making kind of emergency payments to households in the crisis, for example, you see that in sub-Saharan Africa, 80% of governments that made any kind of payments actually did so into an account. And many times they opened kind of new accounts or made kind of what we call over-the-counter transfers into mobile money accounts, working with financial institutions, mobile money service, mobile network providers, mobile money services as they exist, and the regulators to make that work. So I think we need to wrap up, but
Yes.
There's certainly opportunities out there to do so.
Yes, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and colleagues for joining. Thank you so much.